A dirt floor in Maryland. A boy is curled on a corn husk sack in the corner of a kitchen closet, feet pulled up against the cold, wearing the only shirt he owns. Outside the window, the Chesapeake winter is pressing against the glass. Inside, there is no fire. There is no blanket. There is no one coming to check on him. He does not know what year he was born. He does not know what month. He will guess February some day, because someone will mention it in passing, and he will hold that guess the way a person holds something borrowed, carefully, knowing it might have to be returned. That boy will one day walk through the front door of the White House. He will stand before thousands of people in Britain and Ireland and across Europe and hold them in silence with nothing but his voice. He will be photographed more times than any other American of his century, not by accident, but by deliberate and sustained design, because he will understand something about the power of the image that most of his era has not yet worked out. His name will become Frederick Douglass. But on this night, on this floor, in this cold, he is only a child the law considers property. We begin here, settle in, let the noise of the day fall away, and let us travel together to the eastern shore of Maryland, to the life of a man who refused, at every turn, to be what the world had decided he was. Chapter 1. The Boy Without a Birthday. The plantation, called the Great House Farm, sits in Talbot County on the eastern shore of Maryland, on flat land cut through by rivers and creeks that empty eventually into the Chesapeake Bay. In the early 19th century, it was the center of a plantation operation belonging to the Lloyd family, one of the wealthiest families in the state, and it was managed by a man named Aaron Anthony on behalf of Edward Lloyd V, who owned several farms and, according to historical accounts of the period, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 enslaved people. Frederick Douglass was born into that world. The year was most likely 1817 or 1818. He was never certain which year it was. He was never certain of the month. He guessed February, because someone had once mentioned it in passing, and he held that guess the way a person holds something borrowed, carefully, knowing it might have to be returned. He wrote about this uncertainty many times across his life, and the way he wrote about it tells you something important about the quality of mind he was developing. Even as he set the words down, he did not write about it with bitterness, though bitterness would have been entirely justified. He wrote about it with a precise, almost clinical observation, as if he were a naturalist documenting the specific mechanisms by which a system designed to dehumanize people went about its work. The denial of a birthday was not an accident. It was architectural. A child who does not know when he was born cannot fully own the story of his own life. And a person who cannot own the story of his own life is easier to keep in the condition of property. His mother was a woman named Harriet Bailey. She was a field slave on a farm several miles away, and the system that held her made the most ordinary acts of motherhood into logistical challenges that required planning and risk. She came to him at night, walking those miles in the dark after her own day of labour was finished, and she was gone before morning, because the rules of the plantation required her to be back in the fields at dawn. He saw her perhaps 4 or 5 times in his entire childhood. She died when he was around 7 years old, and he learned of it the way he learned most things about his own life, after the fact, from someone who mentioned it in passing, without ceremony, because her death was not the kind of death the world around him considered worth marking. He wrote later that he received the news with no more emotion than he might have felt hearing of the death of a stranger. And then, years later, he revised that statement. He said he believed his apparent lack of feeling was itself a product of the system, that the deliberate separation of mother and child was designed precisely to prevent the formation of the bonds that would make loss feel like loss, that the men who built slavery understood. At some level, that did not require them to articulate it, that grief is a form of recognition, and recognition is a form of humanity, and humanity was the one thing the system could not afford to grant. The woman who raised him was his grandmother, Betsy Bailey. She was a person of considerable standing within the small world available to her, known on the plantation for her skill in cultivating sweet potatoes, respected among the other enslaved people, and possessed of a dignity that the circumstances around her had not managed to erode. She was the first fixed point in Frederick's world. She fed him and held him and taught him, through daily example rather than explicit instruction, that a person could move through conditions designed to diminish them without being diminished. Her house sat at the edge of the woods, set apart from the main plantation, and in his earliest years Frederick did not fully understand that he was enslaved. He understood that he lived with his grandmother and that the world was the size of what he could see from her doorway. He understood that there were older children who sometimes went away and did not come back. He did not yet understand where they went or why. The knowledge came later, in the specific and devastating way that certain kinds of knowledge always come, all at once, without preparation, leaving a mark that does not fade. The day it came for Frederick was the day his grandmother walked him through the woods to the main plantation house. He was around 6 years old. She held his hand on the path, and he thought it was an ordinary walk until they arrived, and he began to understand from something in the quality of her silence, from the particular way she was moving, that this was not an ordinary walk. There were other children at the plantation house. His grandmother introduced him to them and told him they were his brothers and sisters, which confused him because he had not known he had brothers and sisters. And then she walked back into the woods. He ran after her. He reached the edge of the trees and watched her disappear into the shadows between them. And then he sat down in the dirt and cried until someone came and brought him inside. The scholar David Blight, whose biography of Douglass, published in 2018, is considered one of the most comprehensive accounts of his life, describes this moment as Frederick's first conscious encounter with the violence of the slave system, not the violence of the whip, but the specific violence of having the ground removed from beneath you without warning, of learning that the world you thought you lived in was not the world you actually lived in. His life at the great house farm had a texture that he described later in terms specific enough to make you feel the cold. He was not given enough clothing. He was not given enough food. He slept in the corner of a kitchen closet, curled on a small sack filled with corn husks, and in the winter he pushed his feet into that sack and pulled it up around his legs to keep from freezing. He watched the children of the overseer and of the family in the main house, and he understood the distance between their lives and his, not abstractly but physically, in the stomach that was never quite full, in the feet that were always cold. He did not yet have a framework for calling this injustice. He did not yet have the language, but the knowledge that something was wrong, the raw certainty of a child being treated as less than what he is, that was already there, sitting in him like a coal waiting for air. There is something he wrote about in his first autobiography that stays with you long after you have finished reading it. He described hearing, in the early mornings, the sound of enslaved people singing as they walked the roads between farms. He said that as a child he had taken this singing for evidence of happiness, that the people singing must have been content. And then, as he grew older and began to understand the world he was living inside, he revised that interpretation entirely. He came to understand that the singing was not happiness. It was the sound of people carrying something that had no other outlet, pouring into music a grief and a longing that had nowhere else to go. He said he had never, since reaching that understanding, heard those songs without feeling what he could only describe as a deep and unnameable sorrow. That revision, from naive interpretation to honest understanding, was the first of many such revisions Frederick Douglass would make across his lifetime. He was a person who looked at what he had previously believed and was willing to change his mind when the evidence demanded it. That capacity for honest self-correction, for following the truth wherever it led, even when it led somewhere uncomfortable, was the quality that would eventually make him not just a survivor of the system that had tried to erase him, but one of the most consequential voices in the history of American public life. He was 6 years old, sitting in the dirt at the edge of the woods, watching his grandmother disappear between the trees. He did not know any of that yet. He only knew that she was gone, and that the world had just become a different and more frightening place than it had been that morning when she took his hand and walked him down the path toward everything that was coming. The corn husk sack was waiting. The cold was waiting. And somewhere inside him, though he could not have named it, the thing that would eventually become Frederick Douglass was already beginning to take shape, in the way that certain things take shape under pressure, quietly and without announcement, in the dark. Chapter 2. The Word That Broke the Lock. Baltimore, 1826. Frederick is around 8 years old when he arrives in the city, sent by his owner, Aaron Anthony, to serve as a companion to the young son of a man named Hugh Auld. He has spent his entire conscious life on the eastern shore, in the compressed world of the plantation, where the boundaries of existence were drawn tight and the future was a concept that did not apply to people in his condition. Baltimore is something different. It is loud and crowded and full of a kind of motion he has never experienced. Ships in the harbour, men of every description moving through the streets with the purposeful energy of a city that does not pause to ask permission. Free black people walking without chains, without permission papers, without the specific hunched posture of people who have learned that visibility is dangerous. He later said that going to Baltimore was the first indication he ever had that fate, or providence, or whatever force organizes the events of a human life, might have something other than misery in mind for him. The woman he is sent to serve is named Sophia Auld. She has not grown up in a slave-owning household. She comes from a background where labour was something you did yourself, and the habits of that background have not yet been replaced by the habits that owning people tends to produce over time. She looks at Frederick and sees a child. Not property, not a category, a child. And she responds to him the way people respond to children when they have not yet learned to respond to them otherwise, with warmth, with attention, with the instinct to teach. She begins teaching him to read. It starts simply, with the alphabet, then short words, then simple sentences, She teaches him the way she would teach any child who is curious and willing. And he is both of those things with an intensity she cannot have anticipated. He absorbs what she gives him with the speed of someone who has been hungry for exactly this thing, without knowing what to call the hunger. Within a short time he can spell words of 3 and 4 letters. He is on his way. And then Hugh Auld finds out. What follows is one of the most consequential moments in the history of American letters. And it happens in the form of an argument between a husband and a wife that Frederick is not supposed to hear. Hugh Auld tells his wife to stop the lessons immediately. His reasoning, who's delivered with the confidence of a man stating a practical fact, is that teaching a slave to read is not only illegal in the state of Maryland, but dangerous in a way that goes beyond legality. He says that a slave who can read will become dissatisfied. That reading gives a person ideas. That ideas are incompatible with the condition of slavery. That if she continues, she will ruin the boy for the purpose for which he exists. Frederick hears every word. He wrote about this moment many times across his life, and every time he described the same effect. He said that Hugh Auld's words operated on him like a key turning in a lock. Except that the lock was on the outside of a door he had not known he was standing behind. In trying to explain why reading was dangerous, Hugh Auld had given Frederick the most precise and useful map he had ever received. He had identified, without meaning to, exactly the tool that Frederick needed. From that moment on, Frederick understood what he had to do. He could not unlearn what Sophia had already taught him, and he would not stop. He would simply have to continue without her help. What followed was a self-education project of remarkable determination. He was around 10 or 11 years old. Living in a city he was beginning to navigate, and he turned that city into a classroom. He carried bread with him when he went out on errands, because the white boys he encountered in the streets of Baltimore were often hungry. He would approach a boy he did not know and offer a piece of bread in exchange for a short reading lesson, conducted on a street corner or in a doorway, ended before anyone in authority could notice. He accumulated these lessons the way a person in a desert accumulates water, one small portion at a time, understanding that each portion was essential and that nothing could be wasted. The book that changed everything was not a novel or a work of poetry. It was a collection of speeches and essays called The Columbian Orator, a text used in American schools to teach the art of public speaking. Frederick saved enough money to buy a copy from a shop on Thames Street in Baltimore when he was around 12 years old, and what he found inside it was unlike anything he had encountered before. The Columbian Orator contained speeches on liberty. It contained arguments about the rights of human beings. It contained a dialogue between a master and a slave, in which the slave makes a series of arguments for his own freedom, so compelling that the master is persuaded and sets him free. It contained a speech by the Irish politician Richard Brinsley Sheridan, arguing for the rights of a persecuted people, full of the kind of language about human dignity and natural rights that Frederick had never seen assembled in one place before. He read it over and over. He carried it with him and read it in whatever moments of privacy he could find. He read it until the arguments were part of the way he thought, until the language of rights and dignity was woven into the fabric of his own mind. And as that happened, something else happened alongside it, something that Hugh Auld had predicted with uncomfortable accuracy. He became dissatisfied, not in a manageable way, not in the way that could be addressed by better food or easier work or a kinder overseer. He became dissatisfied at the level of first principles, at the level of the question of whether the arrangement he was living inside had any legitimate claim on his existence at all. He read the arguments in the Columbian Orator and tested them against the reality of his own life, and found that the reality did not survive the testing. The institution of slavery, measured against those arguments, was not merely cruel, it was incoherent. It could not justify itself by any standard of reason that Frederick could identify. He wrote about this period with a retrospective anguish that is different from the clinical precision of his earlier descriptions. He said that knowledge had not freed him. It had done something in some ways more difficult. It had shown him the full dimensions of his cage at a time when he had no means of leaving it. He could see clearly now what he had only felt before: the injustice, the fundamental wrongness of his condition, and seeing it clearly did not make it more bearable. It made it less bearable. He said there were moments when he envied the ignorance he had lost, when the ability to analyze his situation felt less like a gift than like a punishment of unusual precision. Sophia Old, in the meantime, was changing. This is one of the parts of the story that Frederick returned to repeatedly, and not without a kind of sorrow. She had been a genuinely kind person when he arrived. She had been capable of seeing him as a human being. And then the system worked on her, not through any single dramatic moment of corruption, but gradually, through the accumulated logic of living inside an institution that required her to stop seeing him as a person in order to function as an owner. She became harder. She policed his reading. She became, over the years, the kind of person she had not been when he arrived. He observed this transformation with the attention of someone taking careful notes, and what he recorded in those notes was something that would become one of the organizing principles of his intellectual life for the next 60 years. That systems shape people. That cruelty is not always a character trait. Sometimes it is a learned behavior, trained into people by the conditions they inhabit, and the people it trains never fully recognize what has happened to them, because the training looks, from the inside, like common sense. He was not yet 14 years old. He had a copy of the Columbian Orator. He had the alphabet. He had the beginning of an argument that he would spend the rest of his life completing, and somewhere in the place where the cold had lived since the night his grandmother walked back into the woods, something was beginning, slowly and cautiously, to warm. Chapter 3. The education of a man the law said wasn't one. A Sunday afternoon, somewhere on the eastern shore, around 1832, a teenage boy is standing in front of 40 people in a space that is not a school, because schools for people in his situation are not legal in the state of Maryland. He is teaching them to read, using the Bible as his text, speaking quietly, with the awareness of someone who understands that what he is doing carries real and immediate risk. His name is Frederick Bailey. He is around 15 years old. He has been sent back to the eastern shore from Baltimore, returned after a dispute between members of the Auld family following Aaron Anthony's death, assigned now to a farm managed by Thomas Auld, Hugh's brother. The difference between Baltimore and the eastern shore registers immediately and physically. The city had given him room to move, intellectually and geographically. The farm contracts everything. The air feels different. The silence feels different. The smallness of it presses against him from the first day. Thomas Auld is a man who has come to slaveholding later in life through marriage rather than inheritance, and Frederick observes him with the close attention he brings to everyone he encounters. He finds in Auld a person who has not settled into the authority that men raised in the system wear naturally. Auld seems to Frederick to be performing the role of master without fully inhabiting it, compensating for his own uncertainty with a cruelty that is spasmodic and sometimes petty. The cruelty of a man trying to convince himself of a power he is not entirely sure he possesses. The Sunday school Frederick organizes draws as many as 40 students before it is discovered and broken up by a group of white men who arrive with clubs and drive everyone away. The response tells you something important about the world he is living inside. The men who break it up are not acting outside the law. They are enforcing it. The education of enslaved people is illegal in the state of Maryland, and the ferocity with which that law is enforced reflects exactly how much the people enforcing it understand is at stake. Every literate, enslaved person is a living argument against the premise on which the system rests. He organized another school, more cautious this time, more deliberate about who he trusted and how visible it allowed itself to become. He taught reading again. He led discussions among the young men around him. He was around 17 and 18 years old, and he was, in the world available to him, doing what he would do for the rest of his life at the largest scale history would eventually give him access to. He was thinking in public. He was building a community of people who understood their own situation more clearly than the system wanted them to. Out of those conversations grew a plan. Frederick and 4 other young men began developing the outline of an escape. They would travel north by water, moving at night, carrying written passes that Frederick would compose himself, because he was the one among them who could write convincingly. They talked through the details over weeks, in the margins of their working days, in the careful whispers of people who understood that the wrong word to the wrong person would end everything. How the plan was discovered is not certain in the historical record. What is certain is the outcome. On the morning they had planned to leave, they were arrested. Frederick was taken first. The written passes were found on his person, and he ate his, tearing the paper and swallowing it before they could be used as evidence. And he later described the action as reflexive, the body moving faster than conscious thought. The other young men were taken as well. They were all jailed in Easton, Maryland. In the jail, Frederick had days to consider what was coming. He could be sold south. That was the most likely serious consequence. And it was serious in the way that only a threat you have watched materialize for other people can be serious. He had seen others sold south. He knew what it meant. The separation from everyone and everything familiar. The journey into conditions generally acknowledged to be worse than those of the Chesapeake region. The effective disappearance from the world he had spent his life navigating. Thomas Auld decided, for reasons the historical record does not make entirely clear, not to sell him south. He was sent back to Baltimore, back to Hugh Auld, back to the city where the reading had started, where the arguments had been practiced, where the ships moved in the harbour and the future was not yet decided. He was around 18 years old. He had planned an escape and watched it fail. But the capacity that had made him plan it, the quality that looked at the world as it was and refused to accept it as the world as it had to be, that capacity was still entirely intact. Thomas Auld, however, had drawn his own conclusion about what Frederick required. He was sending him somewhere else first. He was sending him to a man named Edward Covey. Chapter 4. The Man Who Tried to Break Him. Edward Covey's Farm. January of 1833. The air is cold enough that the breath of the ox team Frederick is trying to manage rises in visible clouds above their heads. He has never handled oxen before. He does not know the specific commands, the particular pressure of the reins, the way you read the body of an animal that weighs several times what you do, and that does not particularly care what you want it to do. Covey gave him the task, knowing this. That was the point. The oxen bolt. They crash into a fence. The fence breaks. Frederick is left standing in the cold with a broken fence and a team he cannot control, and the knowledge that failure in this place is not treated as an occasion for instruction. Covey is coming. To understand what Covey was doing, you have to understand what the profession of Negro breaking actually was in the plantation economy of the antebellum South. It was a recognized and compensated specialty, spoken of in practical terms by the men who needed it and the men who provided it, like any other agricultural service available for hire. What they offered was the systematic destruction of interior resistance, not the destruction of the body, necessarily, though the body was always part of it. The destruction of the will, the reduction of a person who had managed to preserve inside themselves some core of self-determination to a condition where that core no longer functioned. Covey was not a wealthy man. He rented his farm rather than owning it, and the enslaved people he held were leased to him from owners who sent him the difficult cases, the ones who had shown, in one way or another, that they understood more about their situation than was convenient. What he lacked in land and capital he made up for in reputation. People who were sent to Covey came back changed. That was the business proposition, and by the evidence of the clients who kept sending people to him, it worked. His methods were not primarily those of spectacular violence, though violence was part of it. His primary method was something more architectural, more patient, and in some ways more damaging. He created an environment of total surveillance built on the principle of uncertainty. He would disappear from the fields for hours, appearing to have gone to the house or into town, and then reappear without warning, emerging from behind a fence or through a gap in the trees at the precise moment when the people working had allowed themselves to relax slightly. He did this so consistently that Frederick and the other workers could never fully trust any interval of his absence. They could not know, when he was out of sight, whether he was truly gone or standing just beyond the line of their vision, watching. The historian David Blight, drawing on Frederick's own accounts and the broader scholarship on the psychology of slavery, notes that this technique was used with varying degrees of deliberateness across the plantation system. Its effectiveness was not primarily about the specific beatings that followed detection. It was about what it did to the mind during the hours of uncertainty, consuming mental resources that would otherwise be available for thinking, for planning, for maintaining the interior life that makes a person more than the sum of their labour. The first serious beating came within the first week. Frederick described it in his first autobiography, published in 1845, without reaching for drama because the facts do not require it. He was taken to the woods. He was beaten until he bled. He returned to the field. The weeks became months. By midsummer of 1833, Frederick was in a condition he later described with an honesty that is almost uncomfortable to read, across the distance of nearly 2 centuries. He said the thinking had stopped, not because he had chosen to stop, because the combined effect of the violence and the surveillance and the relentless labour and the insufficient food had reduced his capacity for it. The arguments he had been assembling since Baltimore, the careful architecture of ideas about liberty and natural rights that he had built from the Columbian orator and the bread for lessons exchanges on the streets of that city, went quiet inside him, not destroyed, but inaccessible, buried under the weight of a daily existence that consumed everything he had just to get through. He looked at the ships in the Chesapeake Bay, visible from some points on Covey's farm, and felt nothing. He had once looked at ships and felt the entire force of his longing for freedom concentrated in that image. The horizon, the possibility of movement, the world beyond the one he was trapped in. Now he looked at them and they were just ships. The distance between what they represented and what he was capable of feeling had become too great to cross. He wrote that there were days he envied the condition of the ox and the horse, who laboured without knowing what they had lost. He laboured knowing exactly what he had lost, and the knowing made every hour of the labour more costly. The breaking was working. And then came August. A hot afternoon. Frederick collapsed in the field from what may have been heat exhaustion or simple physical depletion after months of inadequate rest. He could not get up. Covey came and kicked him. Frederick still could not get up. Covey struck him across the head with a wooden board. Frederick got up, not because the pain had stopped, because something else had started. What started is difficult to name precisely, and Frederick tried to name it across multiple accounts, across his lifetime, and arrived at slightly different formulations each time, which suggests that the experience itself resisted the clean container of language. He said it was a decision. He said it was a reclamation. He said it was the moment he became, for the first time in his life, genuinely dangerous, in the specific sense that a person who has decided they will not absorb violence without returning it has moved outside the assumptions on which the entire system of control depends. Covey came at him. Frederick took hold of Covey's collar. By Frederick's own account, what followed lasted approximately 2 hours. It was not a clean fight. It was exhausting and tangled. Neither man clearly victorious in the way that fights in stories are victorious. Covey called for help from another enslaved man named Bill, who refused to intervene. Citing his own work as an excuse that everyone present understood was not about the work, Covey called for help from his cousin, who made an attempt and received an injury for it and withdrew. At the end of 2 hours, Covey let Frederick go. He never beat Frederick again. He did not report the confrontation to Thomas Auld. The reason, as Frederick analyzed it later, was self-interest rather than mercy. A slave owner who acknowledged that an enslaved person had physically resisted a Negro breaker would face public acknowledgement that the breaking had failed, which would damage Covey's professional reputation in a community where that reputation was his primary economic asset. The silence protected Covey, but the result of the silence was that Frederick carried no legal consequence for what he had done, and carried instead something far more valuable. He wrote in his first autobiography that the fight with Covey was the turning point in his career as a slave. He used the word career deliberately, because he was a precise writer who chose his words with care, and what he meant was that the fight marked the boundary between 2 distinct phases of his existence under slavery. Before it, he had been, despite everything he knew and believed, subject to the system's central claim about him, that his resistance could be defeated, that the interior life he had constructed could be dismantled by the right combination of pressure and pain. After it, he knew that claim was false, not because he had won in any conventional sense, but because the act of resistance itself had confirmed something about his own nature that Covey's months of systematic effort had failed to disprove. He knew it now in his body, not just in his mind. The remaining months at Covey's farm passed. He returned to the fields every day, did the work. Covey watched him and did not touch him. Frederick watched Covey watch him. Both understood what had happened without either saying it aloud. The transaction between them had shifted, not in any way the law would have recognized, but in the private accounting between two people who both knew what actually occurred. He was sent next to a farm owned by William Freeland, whose treatment of the people he held was, by the standards available for comparison, considerably more humane. And in that slightly larger space, the interior life that Covey had come close to extinguishing came back, cautiously at first, and then with gathering force. The thinking started again. The arguments started again. And behind them, forming slowly in the way that certain kinds of plans form when a person has had time to understand exactly what went wrong with the last one, was the beginning of a new attempt. This time he would not fail. Chapter 5. The Great Escape. New York City, September of 1838. A young man who has been travelling for less than 24 hours sits in a city he does not know, with a small amount of money and the address of a man he has never met. And he feels, as he will write years later, completely alone. Not relieved, not triumphant, alone, in the specific way that a person is alone when they have just arrived somewhere they have been trying to reach for years, and the place turns out to be larger and colder and more indifferent than the imagining of it prepared them for. This is what freedom felt like on the first day. Hold that image for a moment before we go back to how he got here. Frederick had been back in Baltimore for approximately 2 years since the failed escape attempt on the Eastern Shore, working in the shipyards, first under the direct arrangement with Hugh Auld, and then under a modified system in which he found his own work and paid Auld a set weekly amount, keeping whatever he earned above that threshold. The modified arrangement had given him something he had not had before, not freedom, but the shadow of it, small amounts of money that belonged to him, small amounts of time he could direct without asking permission. He used the time well. He deepened his connection to the free black community of Baltimore and to a debating society called the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, where free black men argued about the questions of the day with the formal procedures of parliamentary debate. He was not a free man. He attended anyway, because the intellectual life he had been constructing in private for a decade was ready for a larger room. It was at these meetings that his relationship with a free black woman named Anna Murray deepened from acquaintance to something more serious, more deliberate, more weighted with the specific gravity of two people who understood that what they were building together was not ordinary. Anna Murray deserves more space than history has generally given her. She was born free in 1813 in Denton, Maryland, one of a large family, and had come to Baltimore as a teenager to work as a domestic servant. She was 5 years older than Frederick. practical where he was theoretical, grounded where he was visionary. She had not had the access to books and formal argument that Frederick had clawed out of his circumstances, but she was a person of formidable practical intelligence, and what she saw in Frederick was, by the evidence of her subsequent actions, both a person she loved and a person whose project she understood and chose to support with everything she had. The plan that Frederick and Anna developed together in the fall of 1838 was different from the failed attempt on the Eastern Shore in several fundamental ways. It was simpler. The Eastern Shore plan had involved multiple people moving together, which multiplied both the logistics and the vulnerability. This plan involved one person moving alone, quickly, along a route that had been researched carefully, using a specific mechanism that had worked for others before him. Frederick would travel by train and steamboat, using borrowed identity documents, specifically the sailor's protection papers of a free black seaman, papers that certified the holder as a free American citizen. The physical description in the papers did not match him precisely, but it was close enough that, in the confusion of a busy station and a conductor moving quickly through a car full of passengers, it might pass. The word might carry the entire weight of the plan. Anna Murray sold one of her feather mattresses to help fund the escape. She found or borrowed a sailor's uniform, the visual complement to the papers, the costume that would complete the performance Frederick needed to give. She was not going with him. She was sending him ahead, into a future they had agreed on in private conversations, whose content the historical record does not preserve, but whose direction is clear from everything that followed. On the morning of September 3rd, 1838, Frederick left Baltimore. He moved through the city he had lived in for most of his conscious life, past the shipyards where he had worked, past the streets he knew, toward the train station. He was wearing the sailor's uniform. He had the papers. He had the address of a man in New York named David Ruggles, a free black abolitionist who was part of the network that helped people in Frederick's situation navigate arrival in the North. He later described the train ride as an experience that existed in a register that ordinary language does not quite reach. Every time someone looked at him, he measured the look for recognition. Every time the conductor moved through the car, he tracked the conductor's progress and calculated whether the moment of inspection would be the moment the plan fell apart. In his later accounts, Frederick recalled an encounter with a man on the train who appeared to recognize that his papers did not match his description, and he held the conversation together through the specific discipline of a person who understands that the performance ending means everything ending. He changed from train to steamboat. He crossed state lines. He reached New York. And then the aloneness arrived, as he described it in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855, with a candour that his first autobiography had not quite reached. He said the city felt enormous and indifferent. He said the freedom he had reached was not the freedom he had imagined. Or rather, that it was exactly the freedom he had imagined, but that the imagining had not included the specific texture of what freedom felt like when you were new to it and had no community and no history in the place you had arrived, and no certainty about who could be trusted. He was also afraid. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that his legal status as escaped property did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line. He was not safe in New York. He was less unsafe than he had been in Maryland. But the distance between less unsafe and safe was a distance he felt acutely in those first days. He found David Ruggles, who took him in and housed him while the next steps were arranged. He sent word to Anna Murray. She came north within days. They were married in New York on September 15th, 1838, 12 days after his escape, in a ceremony performed by a black Presbyterian minister named James W. C. Pennington, who was himself formerly enslaved and who would later become a significant figure in the abolitionist movement. Ruggles advised them to leave New York. The city was too visible, too accessible to the slave catchers who worked it regularly. He suggested New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling city with a substantial free black community and a reputation for the kind of underground solidarity that made it one of the safer destinations in the North for people in Frederick's situation. They went to New Bedford. The city was a revelation. It was prosperous in a way that challenged one of the foundational arguments of the slave economy, that black people could not survive, and certainly could not thrive, without the structure that the institution of slavery provided. New Bedford's black community was demonstrably thriving. Families owned their homes. People ran businesses. Children went to school. The normality of it was almost disorienting for Frederick, after a lifetime of being told that such normality was impossible for people like him. He changed his name. He had been travelling as Frederick Bailey in New Bedford, following the suggestion of a man named Nathan Johnson, who had helped house them on their arrival. He took a new last name, drawn from a character in a poem by the Scottish writer Walter Scott. He modified the spelling and became Frederick Douglass. He went to work in the shipyards, because caulking was the trade he knew, and the arrangement he found there was different in a way that he described. Years later, with a feeling that still registered as wonder even after all the years between the experience and the writing, he worked, and at the end of the week the wages came back to him. All of them. He held them in his hand, and no one came to take them. He said it was among the most powerful experiences of his life. He had known, intellectually, that this was what freedom meant in practical economic terms. But knowing it intellectually and holding the coins in his hand and feeling no one's approach were different things. And the difference was not abstract. It was in his chest. It was in the specific quality of his breathing in that moment, which was the breathing of a man holding something that belonged entirely to him. He subscribed to a newspaper called The Liberator, published by a man named William Lloyd Garrison, the most prominent voice in the American abolitionist movement. Frederick read Garrison the way he had read the Columbian Orator as a boy, with the recognition of someone who encounters language that articulates something they have been carrying without the words for it. He began attending the meetings of the New Bedford Anti-Slavery Society. He listened. He was a man in the audience, taking in the arguments, measuring them against his own experience, neither agreeing nor disagreeing aloud. That was about to change. It would change on a specific August evening in 1841, on the island of Nantucket, at a convention of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. But that is the next chapter. For now, hold the image of him in New Bedford, in the small house he and Anna had made together, the wages in his hand, the Liberator on the table, the harbour outside the window with its ships moving in the cold Massachusetts water. He was 20 years old. He was free, and the world was about to find out what that meant. Chapter 6. The Voice That Rewrote America. Nantucket, Massachusetts, August of 1841. A young man who is not on the program stands up in a crowded hall. He is 23 years old. He has been in the audience for most of the convention, listening, measuring, taking in the arguments with the attention of someone who has been preparing for something without knowing exactly what he has been preparing for. William Lloyd Garrison is in the room, already one of the most recognized voices in the American abolitionist movement. The hall is full of people who have been arguing against slavery in public for years. People with practiced rhetoric and established positions and the fluency that comes from having made the same arguments many times in many rooms. And then Frederick Douglass stands up. What he said that evening in Nantucket is not preserved verbatim. No transcript was made. What is preserved is the response of the people who were there, including a man named William Coffin, who had heard Frederick speak informally in New Bedford and who encouraged him to take the floor, and including Garrison himself, who wrote about the evening afterward with the specific excitement of a person who has witnessed something that changes his understanding of what is possible. Frederick spoke about his own life. He spoke about the Eastern Shore and the dirt floor and the corn husk sack and the cold. He spoke about Sophia Auld teaching him to read and Hugh Auld explaining why reading was dangerous. He spoke about Covey and the field and the 2-hour fight that had changed everything. He spoke about New Bedford and the wages in his hand, and the specific feeling of holding something that belonged entirely to him for the first time in his life. He spoke without notes. In the voice of a man reporting on a subject he knew with the completeness of someone who had lived inside it, and the people in that hall heard something they could not have assembled for themselves. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when people are not simply listening, but receiving. Garrison stood up after Frederick sat down and asked the audience whether they had heard a man or a thing. He was making the abolitionist argument in the sharpest possible form, pointing at Frederick as living evidence that the premise of the slave system, that the people it held were not fully human, was not only morally wrong, but empirically absurd. The man who had just spoken was the refutation made flesh. Frederick was offered a position as a travelling lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society almost immediately. He would travel with white abolitionist speakers to meetings across the North, and he would tell his story. His story would function as the experiential grounding for the intellectual and moral arguments the other speakers made. He would be, in the framework the society was offering him, the evidence. He accepted, and he spent the next several years doing exactly that, travelling through New England and New York and Ohio and Indiana, standing on platforms in lyceums and churches and rented halls, telling the story of his life to audiences that ranged from sympathetic to hostile to simply curious, learning through practice what it meant to hold a room, to manage the specific energy of a crowd that did not all want to hear the same thing. The hostile audiences were educational in their own way. He encountered mobs in Indiana that threw things, and once broke his hand when he tried to defend a colleague from physical attack. He encountered men who challenged his story directly, who argued that no enslaved person could possibly have the eloquence he displayed, whose argument was, therefore, that he must be lying, that he must be a free black man, pretending to a history he had not lived. His very competence was taken as evidence against his credibility. He decided to write it down, not a pamphlet or a summary, a full autobiography, naming names and places and dates with the specificity of a legal brief, providing the kind of verifiable detail that would make the claim of invention impossible to sustain. He would name the plantation, he would name the county, he would name Aaron Anthony and Thomas Auld and Hugh Auld and Edward Covey. He understood exactly what this meant. It meant that the people he named would know where he was. The legal status he carried as escaped property, which the law of the United States maintained regardless of where he lived in the North, would be paired with a published account that removed every ambiguity about his identity. He wrote it anyway. The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, was published in May of 1845 by the Anti-Slavery Office in Boston. It was 125 pages. It named names. It provided dates. It described events with the precision of someone who had been observing and recording his own experience since the moment he understood that his experience mattered. The historian David Blight notes that the narrative was not simply a personal account, but a political document of considerable strategic design, structured to advance specific arguments about the nature of slavery that the anti-slavery movement needed, made in this particular form, by this particular kind of witness, at this particular moment in American public life. Within a few months, it had sold several thousand copies. Within a few years, it had gone through multiple editions in the United States and been published in Britain and Ireland. The people who had argued that no enslaved person could have produced such a document were now confronted with the fact that one had. The book also created the danger Frederick had anticipated. His name was on the cover. His owner's name was in the text. The gap between his location and Thomas Auld's knowledge of it had closed to a dangerous proximity. He sailed to Britain in August of 1845. He arrived in a country that received him differently than any place he had ever been, not as a formerly enslaved man, not as evidence of a political argument, but as a person whose words and ideas were the primary thing about him in the rooms he entered. He spoke in packed halls in Dublin and Cork and Belfast. Arriving in Ireland in the fall of 1845, as the early stages of the famine were becoming impossible to ignore, and the experience of witnessing that suffering produced in him a complicated response that he was honest enough to articulate publicly. He felt solidarity with the Irish poor, and recognized in their condition something that rhymed with the condition of enslaved people in America. But he also recognized that poverty and bondage were not the same condition, and that the difference between them was not merely a matter of degree. He spent nearly 2 years in Britain and Ireland, speaking in hundreds of venues, and the person who moved through those rooms was not the nervous young man who had stood up for the first time in Nantucket. He was a fully formed public speaker, in command of his material and his audience, capable of moving between the personal and the analytical with a fluency that the best speakers of his era recognized as exceptional. A group of British abolitionists raised the money to purchase his legal freedom, $150, paid to Hugh Auld, who signed the papers transferring legal ownership of Frederick Douglass to Frederick Douglass. He addressed the criticism that he had participated in the legal framework that defined him as property with the directness that characterized his public life. He said he considered the legal fiction of his ownership no more legitimate after the payment than before it, but that the practical consequence was that he could return to the United States without the immediate risk of recapture, and that his work required him to be in the United States. The argument was practical, and it was his. He returned to America in 1847 with something he had not taken with him when he left, a plan. He wanted a newspaper. The plan had been forming throughout the 2 years in Britain, shaped by a growing conviction that was beginning to create friction with the organisation that had given him his first platform. William Lloyd Garrison's position was that the Constitution of the United States was a pro-slavery document, irrevocably compromised by its accommodation of slavery, and that the proper response of moral people was to refuse to participate in the political system it governed, to pursue abolition through moral persuasion alone, and to leave voting and political engagement to the people who had not understood the full moral weight of what they were participating in. Frederick had lived inside the institution. He had tested its logic against his own experience with a rigour that years of practice had made formidable, and he was arriving at a different conclusion. He was beginning to believe that the Constitution could be read not as a protection of slavery, but as a mandate against it, that the language of natural rights embedded in the document's foundations pointed toward abolition rather than away from it, and that the practical tools of political engagement, voting, organising, electing people who would use the government's power against the institution rather than in its defence, were tools that the movement could not afford to leave unused. A newspaper meant independence. It meant making his own editorial judgments. It meant building something that belonged to him and that advanced his own analysis rather than serving as a particularly effective component of someone else's institutional project. Garrison did not want him to have one. The reasons Garrison gave were practical. Frederick understood, and the historian David Blight has documented this understanding clearly, that the practical arguments were not the whole of it. He started the newspaper anyway. The North Star published its first issue on December 3rd, 1847, from Rochester, New York. The name came from the navigational reality that escaped enslaved people used to orient themselves on their journey toward freedom. The masthead carried the motto, "Right is of no sex. Truth is of no colour. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." He chose Rochester deliberately, not Boston, where Garrison's network was centred, not New York, where the abolitionist establishment had its institutional weight. Rochester, at the edge of the settled North, close to Canada, a city that had been a way station for people making the journey Frederick had made, a city whose geography matched the argument he was making about where the movement needed to go. He was 30 years old. He had escaped slavery, written a book that travelled across 2 continents, spoken to hundreds of thousands of people in 2 countries, been legally purchased from the man who owned him, and started a newspaper. And the arguments he had been building since the afternoon, Hugh Auld explained why reading was dangerous. The arguments he had been refining through every speech and every hostile audience, and every night in a rented room in a city he had just arrived in. Those arguments now had a publication. They had a masthead. They had his name on them. He was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he thought. The press was running. The ink was vet. And the man who had spent his childhood without a name that fully belonged to him now had his name on something that would go out into the world every week and say, in his own voice and by his own analysis, exactly what he believed was true. Chapter 7. The Man Who Outgrew His Movement. Rochester, New York. The office of the North Star. Sometime in 1850. Frederick Douglass is sitting at a desk covered in papers and letters. It is late. The print shop downstairs has gone quiet, Outside the window, the Rochester winter is pressing against the glass, and the city beyond it is the city he chose because it was not Boston, because distance from Garrison's network was itself a kind of argument, a physical statement about the independence that the newspaper was supposed to represent. He is reading a letter from Gerrit Smith. Smith is a wealthy land reformer in Peterborough, New York, and a political abolitionist, and he has been making, in careful and well-sourced terms, an argument that Frederick has been turning over in his mind for 2 years now. The argument is about the Constitution. The argument is that the Constitution of the United States does not have to be read as a pro-slavery document, that the specific compromises Garrison points to are real and troubling, but that the broader language of the document, the preamble's commitment to establishing justice and securing the blessings of liberty, the due process clauses, the equal protection logic embedded in the framework, can be read as a mandate for abolition rather than a sanction of slavery, that the Constitution can be used as a weapon against the institution rather than as its legal foundation. Frederick folds the letter and looks at the window. To understand why this question matters so much, you have to understand what Garrison had meant to him in the years before the rupture. When Frederick stood up in Nantucket in 1841, Garrison had been the most prominent moral voice against slavery in America. His newspaper, The Liberator, had been publishing since 1831 with an uncompromising directness that was genuinely unusual in American public life, which had a long tradition of accommodating the slave interest by treating it as a regional political question rather than a moral catastrophe. Garrison refused that accommodation. He said slavery was a sin. He said it had to end. He said that the documents and institutions of the American Republic, insofar as they accommodated it, were morally invalid. For a young man who had spent his entire conscious life developing the argument that what had been done to him was wrong, not just painful, but fundamentally wrong, Garrison's framework was the first public language he had encountered that fully matched the weight of what he carried. The connection between them was real. The debt Frederick owed to the platform and the institutional support that Garrison's organization had provided was real, but the thinking had not stopped. Garrison's position, arrived at through his own careful and sincere analysis, was that a document with the 3/5 compromise and the fugitive slave clause embedded in its structure could not be used as an instrument of liberation, and that the appropriate response was to refuse to participate in the political system it governed, and to pursue abolition through moral persuasion alone. Frederick had initially accepted this analysis, and then he encountered Smith's argument, and he tested it, and he argued about it privately and then publicly, and over the course of several years, sitting at desks like this one in the late Rochester night, he arrived at a position that aligned with Smith rather than Garrison. He announced his change of view in the North Star in 1851. The response from Garrison was not gracious. The historian David Blight, drawing on extensive correspondence from this period, documents a break that became personal as well as intellectual, characterized by the specific bitterness that tends to accompany disagreements between people who have been close. Garrison accused Frederick of ingratitude. He questioned whether the change in position was intellectually honest, or whether it had been influenced by Gerrit Smith's financial support of the newspaper. Frederick responded with the same directness he brought to everything, acknowledging the genuine debt to Garrison and the movement, while insisting that his thinking was his own and that he had the right to follow it wherever it led. The accusation that his changed position was bought rather than reasoned was the one that stung most. Frederick had spent his entire life building the capacity for independent thought in conditions specifically designed to prevent it. The suggestion that his conclusions were for sale struck at the deepest part of his identity, the part that had been forming since the night he read the Columbian Orator by whatever light he could find on the streets of Baltimore, and understood that thinking clearly and honestly was the one thing no one could take from him. He was not finished evolving. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 sent a shock through the entire free black community of the North that the white abolitionist movement, for all its moral seriousness, could not fully share. The act required federal authorities, and in fact all citizens, to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. It imposed severe penalties on anyone who helped a person in Frederick's former situation reach safety. It made explicit what had always been legally true, but had been practically softened by geography, that the United States government, at the federal level, was an active participant in the enforcement of slavery, regardless of where you lived. For Frederick, the act clarified something he had been circling. The moral suasion strategy assumed a political system that could be moved by moral argument alone. The Fugitive Slave Act demonstrated, in the most practical terms, that the political system was not operating on those terms. The law was not waiting for moral consensus. It was enforcing the opposite. He began to argue more explicitly for political action, for voting, for engagement with the electoral system, for the use of the Constitution as Smith had argued it could be used. He formed relationships with political abolitionists who were building the infrastructure of what would eventually become the Republican Party. He maintained his friendship with the radical abolitionist John Brown, a relationship that was complicated from the beginning and would become more complicated as Brown's methods grew more extreme. Brown was a man of absolute conviction who believed that slavery was a war that had to be fought as a war, with violence, and that the moral hesitation of the mainstream abolitionist movement about armed resistance was itself a form of complicity. He had been developing plans for an armed uprising since at least the late 1840s, and he discussed those plans with Frederick in considerable detail over the course of their friendship. Frederick admired Brown. He wrote about him with a warmth and respect that was not performative. He understood the argument for violence. He had been on the receiving end of the violence the system used to maintain itself, and he did not suffer from the illusion, available to people who had never experienced that violence directly, that it would respond to moral suasion the way a reasonable person responds to a compelling argument. But he did not join Brown's plan. When Brown invited Frederick to participate in the raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859, Frederick declined. In his later accounts, Frederick described warning Brown in terms that suggest he foresaw the specific consequences, that the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry would bring the full force of the United States government down on them, that the enslaved people in the surrounding area would not rise in the way Brown imagined, and that the result would be Brown's death and the intensification of repression against the free black community and the anti-slavery movement in the aftermath. He was right. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged in December of 1859. The raid had exactly the consequences Frederick had anticipated. It also, in the specific alchemy of American political history, had consequences that neither Frederick nor Brown had fully anticipated. It made the continuation of slavery in the existing political framework look, to a larger number of northern white Americans than before, like an impossibility. The violence that Brown had forced into visibility was not the violence of the enslaved against the system. It was the violence of the system protecting itself, and the protection looked, from certain angles, like a portrait of something that could not be reformed. Frederick had to leave the country briefly after Harper's Ferry. He had been corresponding with Brown, and the authorities wanted to question him. He went to Britain again, a shorter visit this time. Returning, when the immediate danger had passed, he came back to a country moving, with the lurching momentum of a political system approaching a point of no return, toward a confrontation that Frederick had been predicting for 20 years. The election of 1860 was approaching. The fractures in the Democratic Party over the expansion of slavery were deepening into chasms that would not be bridged. A lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln was seeking the Republican nomination. Frederick Douglass watched all of it with the attention of someone who had spent 20 years preparing to understand exactly this moment. He was 42 years old. He had a newspaper and a following, and a set of arguments that were sharpening daily against the whetstone of events. He had outgrown the movement that had found him, not by moving away from its principles, but by moving further into them than the movement had been willing to go. The country was finally, agonizingly, moving toward the confrontation that the arguments had always been pointing toward. The question was not whether it was coming. The question was what it would cost, and whether the cost, when it arrived, would purchase what the people paying it had been promised. Frederick Douglass had been asking that question his entire life. Outside the window, the Rochester winter pressed against the glass. The press downstairs was quiet. He turned back to the papers on his desk. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Chapter 8. Lincoln, War, and the question he refused to let die. Washington, D.C., August of 1863. A formerly enslaved man from Maryland is walking through the front door of the White House. He has requested this meeting himself, and the request has been granted, which is itself a fact worth pausing on. The United States of America in 1863 is a country at war with itself over the question of whether the people who look like this man are human beings or property, and the man walking through the door has spent 22 years arguing, in print and in person, for the answer that the war has not yet fully settled. His name is Frederick Douglass. He is 45 years old, and he has come to see the President. To understand this meeting, and the two that followed it, requires understanding the specific and complicated territory that existed between these two men before they ever sat in the same room. Frederick had not trusted Lincoln in the way he might have trusted a man whose entire career had been built on the explicit moral argument against slavery. Lincoln was not that man. Lincoln was a politician from Illinois who had built his national reputation on the argument that slavery should not expand into new territories, which was a very different thing from arguing that slavery should end where it already existed. Frederick understood the difference between those two positions with a precision that the political moment did not always reward. He had watched the election of 1860 with the mixture of hope and skepticism that his experience with American political institutions had trained him to bring to everything. When Lincoln won and the Southern states began the process of secession that would become the Confederacy, Frederick understood that the confrontation he had been predicting for 20 years was beginning. But the war that started at Fort Sumter in April of 1861 was not, at its beginning, the war Frederick needed it to be. Lincoln was explicit about this. The war was being fought, in the administration's framing, to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. Enslaved people who escaped to Union lines were being returned to their owners in some cases, because the legal framework of the war's early months had not yet resolved the question of whether escaped enslaved people were contraband of war or property to be returned. The distinction mattered enormously to the people whose lives turned on it, and Frederick watched the administration's handling of it with the close attention of someone who understood that the gap between what the war was officially about and what it needed to become was a gap that required constant pressure to close. He applied the pressure from the first day. Through his newspaper, he wrote about the war with a clarity that the administration's official position did not match. He argued from the beginning that a war to preserve the Union without ending slavery was a war to preserve the contradiction at the Union's center. He argued that the only war worth fighting was a war that ended slavery, and that the sooner the administration acknowledged this, the sooner the war could be prosecuted with the full moral force the cause required. He also argued something the military establishment was not yet ready to hear. He argued that black men should be allowed to fight. The argument was not purely moral, though the moral dimension was real. It was also strategic. The Confederacy was using enslaved labor to build fortifications, supply armies, and sustain the agricultural economy that fed the war effort. The Union was refusing to use the military capacity of the free black men of the North and the escaped enslaved men making their way to Union lines in increasing numbers. Frederick pointed out the arithmetic of this situation with the directness that characterized everything he wrote. The side that used all of its available human resources against the side that was leaving significant human resources unused had a structural advantage that no amount of superior motivation could entirely compensate for. He pressed this argument for nearly 2 years before the administration moved. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, was the pivot point. It declared that all enslaved people in states then in rebellion against the United States were free. It did not free the enslaved people in the border states that had not seceded, because Lincoln's legal argument for the proclamation was grounded in his war powers as commander-in-chief, and those war powers extended only to the territory of the enemy. It was a document with significant legal limitations and significant political calculations embedded in its language. Frederick received it with a response characteristic of him in its complexity. He celebrated it. He was present at a gathering in Boston on the night of December 31st, 1862, waiting with hundreds of others for confirmation that Lincoln had signed. And when the confirmation came, the celebration was genuine and felt. Because the proclamation represented the formal alignment of the Union's war aim with the moral reality that Frederick had been insisting on since the war began. He also criticized it. In print and in speeches, he noted its limitations with the same precision he brought to his celebrations. He was not willing to treat a necessary but incomplete step as a final destination, because the people whose freedom was at stake could not afford that kind of satisfied stopping. And then the door that the proclamation had cracked open moved further. Black men were allowed to enlist. Frederick threw himself into the work of recruitment with everything he had. He travelled and spoke and wrote, making the argument that black men fighting for the Union were not simply fighting for the Union, but claiming, through the act of military service, the citizenship that the Republic had denied them. He convinced two of his own sons, Lewis and Charles Douglass, to enlist. Lewis Douglass served as a sergeant major in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official black units in the Union Army. In July of 1863, the regiment participated in the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, attacking a heavily fortified Confederate position across open beach under concentrated fire. Historical accounts document that the regiment suffered casualties of approximately 40% of its engaged strength in that assault. The attack did not take the fort, but it produced a demonstration of the courage and discipline of black soldiers under fire that was documented by journalists present and discussed across the North, with an effect on public opinion that Frederick had predicted and argued for and was now watching materialize at a cost he had not been able to fully anticipate when he sent his own son to the recruiting office. And then he walked through the front door of the White House. He had requested the meeting because of specific and practical grievances. Black soldiers in the Union Army were being paid less than white soldiers of equivalent rank. Black soldiers captured by the Confederacy were being executed or sold back into slavery, rather than treated as prisoners of war. Frederick wanted the president to address both of these things. And he went to Washington with the directness of a man who had been making arguments in public for 20 years and had not developed a habit of softening them for powerful audiences. What he found surprised him. He had expected to wait for hours. He was kept waiting briefly, and when he was shown into Lincoln's office, the president rose from his chair to greet him and extended his hand. Frederick later described the greeting as a gesture made by a man who was making a deliberate point through a physical action that required no verbal statement. They talked at length. Lincoln was direct about the political constraints he was operating under. He explained the pay disparity in terms that Frederick found unsatisfying but honest, that the enlistment of black soldiers had required political compromises that he was working to address, but could not address immediately. He was less forthcoming about the question of the Confederacy's treatment of captured black soldiers. Frederick pressed him. Lincoln listened. He did not give Frederick everything he asked for. He gave him more than Frederick had expected. Frederick left the meeting with a revised assessment of the man he had just spent time with. He did not revise his criticisms. The pay disparity continued. The administration's pace on these issues remained, from Frederick's perspective, slower than the urgency of the situation demanded. But he had met Lincoln as a person, and the person he had met was different from the political calculation he had been analyzing from a distance. He met Lincoln a second time in August of 1864, at a point when the war was going badly enough that Lincoln's re-election was genuinely uncertain. The Democratic candidate George McClellan was running on a platform that included a negotiated peace, which, in practical terms, meant a peace that preserved slavery in the Confederate States. Lincoln called Frederick to the White House to discuss a plan for getting as many enslaved people as possible out of the Confederate States and into Union territory before the election, in case McClellan won and negotiated an end to the war that left them behind. The conversation was a remarkable one, and Frederick described it later with a specificity that reflects how carefully he had paid attention. Lincoln was asking him, the man who had escaped slavery and spent 20 years arguing for its end, to help plan for the possibility that the political system might not deliver what the moral argument required, and to work within that possibility to save as many people as could be saved in the time available. It was a request that contained within it an acknowledgement of the limits of what the Republic could guarantee, and it was made to Frederick Douglass because Lincoln understood, by this point, that Frederick Douglass was someone whose analysis of those limits was more reliable than most. Frederick agreed to help. McClellan did not win. The plan was not needed. But the conversation remained with Frederick as evidence of something about Lincoln that the public record of the presidency did not always make visible. He met Lincoln a third time on the evening of Lincoln's second inauguration. In March of 1865, he attended the reception at the White House and was initially blocked from entering by officers who told him that no persons of his description were to be admitted. He sent word to Lincoln. Lincoln had him admitted immediately, and when Frederick entered and approached him, Lincoln's face showed what Frederick described as genuine and specific pleasure. Lincoln told him that he had seen Frederick in the crowd during the inaugural address and had watched his face. He said he wanted to know what Frederick thought of the speech. Frederick told him it was a sacred document. He meant it. The second inaugural address was the speech in which Lincoln framed the war as a national reckoning, a punishment visited on the entire country for the sin of slavery that the entire country, North and South, had permitted and benefited from. It came closer than any previous presidential speech to saying, in the language of official power, what Frederick had been saying for 20 years in the language of a man who had lived inside the institution. Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theatre on the evening of April 14th, 1865, and died the following morning. Frederick received the news in Rochester and described the days that followed with a grief that surprised him in its depth, because he had maintained a careful, critical distance from Lincoln throughout the war, and had not permitted himself to mistake that distance for indifference. He wrote about Lincoln with the complexity the man deserved. Douglass could praise Lincoln as the black man's president, while later remembering him, with painful honesty, as preeminently the white man's president. Both statements were his own, made at different moments for different purposes, and the tension between them was not a contradiction, but a portrait. The most honest portrait Frederick knew how to make of a man who had been both things simultaneously and who had died before the full reckoning of which thing mattered more could be completed. The war ended in April of 1865. The Confederacy collapsed. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December of 1865, made the abolition of slavery permanent and national. Frederick had spent 20 years arguing that this moment would come and must come and could come if the country was willing to pay the cost. The country had paid the cost. The moment had come. And Frederick knew, with the knowledge of a man who had spent 20 years understanding the difference between the legal abolition of slavery and the actual freedom of the people it had held, that the moment was not the end of the argument, it was the beginning of the next one. Chapter 9. The Long Defeat of Reconstruction. A schoolroom in South Carolina. The winter of 1865. The building is new, still smelling of raw lumber, put up quickly by the Freedmen's Bureau on land that 6 months ago held something else. The teacher is a young woman from Ohio who has come south with the Bureau, one of hundreds who made that journey in the months following the war's end, carrying textbooks and chalk, and the specific conviction of people who believe that education is the most urgent thing the moment requires. The man sitting at the desk in the back row is around 40 years old. His hands are the hands of someone who has done field work his entire life, wide and calloused, and not quite comfortable holding the pencil the teacher has given him. He does not look like the other students, who are mostly children. He does not care. He is writing his name for the first time. His name is his. The law has said so since January of 1863, but writing it, seeing it appear under his own hand in letters that he has just learned to form, makes it real in a way that the law alone did not make it real. This is what the beginning of Reconstruction looked like on the ground. Frederick Douglass watched all of it with the attentiveness of someone who had been studying the gap between American promise and American practice his entire life, and was now watching that gap being contested in real time. In schoolrooms like this one, and in legislative chambers, and in the daily lives of 4 million people who had been legally freed, and were now attempting to exercise the freedom the law said they had, what he saw in the early years was, in some respects, extraordinary. Black men voted in significant numbers, with the protection of federal troops stationed in the South to enforce the new constitutional order. Black men were elected to office, to state legislatures across the South, to the United States House of Representatives, to the United States Senate. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black United States Senator in 1870, taking the seat that had been held by Jefferson Davis before Davis left to lead the Confederacy. These were facts that the entire previous history of the Republic had made seem impossible, and they were happening. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited the denial of voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These were transformations of the legal framework of the Republic so fundamental that the people who had spent 20 years arguing for them had difficulty, in some cases, fully absorbing that they had occurred. Frederick absorbed them with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to confuse the legal statement with the practical reality, but also with a genuine recognition that the legal statements mattered, that the architecture of rights embedded in those amendments was the foundation on which the practical reality could, in principle, be built. He allowed himself to feel what the evidence seemed to justify feeling, that the direction of movement was the right direction, that the foundation being built was a foundation that could hold something. He was wrong about how long it would hold. The resistance to Reconstruction in the southern states began immediately and never stopped. It operated through violence, through the systematic terrorizing of black voters and black office holders and the white Republicans who supported them, carried out by organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which emerged in the South in the years following the war's end. And the White League and the Red Shirts and the dozens of other paramilitary groups that functioned as the enforcement arm of a project whose goal was the restoration of white political supremacy by whatever means were required. Frederick wrote about this violence with a directness that the political climate of the period made uncomfortable for many of his readers, including some of his white abolitionist allies who had moved on from the crisis of slavery and were not eager to sustain the level of political engagement that addressing the ongoing crisis of Reconstruction required. He named the violence for what it was. He connected it explicitly to the larger project of undoing the legal and political changes that the war and the amendments had produced. He argued that the federal government had both the legal authority and the moral obligation to protect the civil rights of black citizens in the South, and that its failure to exercise that authority was not a neutral act, but a choice with consequences. The consequences accumulated. The presidential election of 1876 produced a disputed result between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel Tilden that was resolved through a political compromise in 1877. The details of what became known as the Compromise of 1877 are complex, but its essential consequence for Reconstruction was straightforward. Hayes became president. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. The military enforcement of the constitutional rights of black citizens in the former Confederate states ended. Frederick was 60 years old in 1877, the year the troops came home. He sat at his desk at Cedar Hill on the day the news came, and he understood, with the specific understanding of a man who had spent 36 years studying the mechanisms by which the Republic failed to be what it said it was, exactly what the withdrawal meant. Not immediately, not all at once, but, inevitably, the legal framework was still there. The amendments were still in the Constitution, but a legal framework without enforcement is a promise without a hand behind it. And Frederick had learned, from the eastern shore of Maryland to the halls of Congress, that the distance between a promise and its fulfillment is the distance where the most damage is done. What followed the withdrawal of federal troops was swift, systematic, and thorough. The state legislatures of the South began dismantling the political gains of Reconstruction through a combination of legal mechanisms and extra-legal violence. Voting rights were restricted through poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and the specific terrorism of election day violence that made the formal right to vote meaningless for people whose exercise of it put their lives and their families at risk. He did not go quiet. In April of 1876, he gave a speech in Washington, D.C., at the unveiling of the Freedmen's Memorial Monument. A statue depicting Lincoln standing over a kneeling, formerly enslaved man. The speech is one of the most carefully constructed of his career. He honored Lincoln with specific and genuine praise. And then he said, speaking to a black audience with the directness he reserved for the moments that mattered most, that Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, their man. That Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. That for black Americans, Lincoln was devoted to the welfare of white men first, and that they were at best his stepchildren, given consideration not from genuine commitment, but from the political necessities of the moment. The speech refused to let the comfortable version of Lincoln's legacy stand in place of the complicated true version, because the comfortable version was being used, in 1876, by people who wanted to close the book on Reconstruction without delivering what Reconstruction had promised. The Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 in 1883, ruling that the 14th Amendment prohibited state discrimination but not private discrimination, a distinction that effectively removed the federal government's ability to address the systematic exclusion of black Americans from public life. Frederick wrote about the decision with the controlled fury of a man who had spent decades watching the law used as an instrument of both liberation and its opposite. He said the decision had snatched from black Americans the shield the Supreme Court had the power to hold between them and a hostile world. He continued to accept federal appointments within the system he was criticizing, because he understood that the inside and the outside of a system are not always the same struggle. He was appointed United States Marshal for the District of Columbia in 1877, becoming the first black man to hold that position. He was appointed Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia in 1881. He would later be appointed United States Minister to Haiti in 1889 by President Benjamin Harrison. Each appointment placed him in a complicated relationship with the administrations that appointed him, because accepting a position within a system meant operating within the constraints of that system, and those constraints did not always align with the positions Frederick would have taken as a free critic on the outside. He navigated this complication with varying degrees of satisfaction, understanding that both the inside position and the outside voice served the argument, and that neither alone was sufficient. The convict leasing system was consolidating itself across the South through the 1880s, a mechanism by which formerly enslaved people were arrested on minor or fabricated charges and leased to private employers as forced labour. Frederick named this for what it was in speeches and in print, with the specific precision of a man who understood that the form of a thing does not change its substance. Slavery by another name was still slavery. And the republic that had abolished slavery in the Constitution and then permitted its resurrection under a different legal heading was a republic that had not yet honestly reckoned with what it had done. He was an old man by then. He was not a quiet old man. There is a temptation, in telling the story of Douglass in these years, to frame the period as a decline, as the gradual defeat of a man whose greatest work was behind him. That framing is not accurate. It does not account for the quality of the fighting, for the speeches he gave in these years that rank among the most powerful of his career, for the analysis he produced of what was happening and why, and what it meant for the Republic's claim to be what its founding documents said it was. He pressed on, because the alternative was to stop pressing, and stopping was the one thing his entire life had been constructed to prevent him from doing. The schoolroom in South Carolina was still there. The man who had written his name for the first time was still alive, somewhere in the South, living inside the consequences of the decisions being made in Washington and in state capitals by people who had decided that the promise of Reconstruction was a promise they did not intend to keep. Frederick Douglass was still keeping track. The accounting was still running, patient and exact, as it had always run. Chapter 10. The Camera and the Controlled Image. Philadelphia, sometime in the 1850s, a man walks into a photography studio on Chestnut Street, removes his coat, and sits down in front of a camera. The photographer adjusts the equipment, arranges the lighting, and asks him to hold still. The man settles into the chair with the ease of someone who has done this before, straightens his back, and turns his face toward the lens. He does not smile, not because the session is unpleasant, not because he is uncomfortable in the room, because he has thought carefully about what the camera is, what it does, what it carries out into the world after the session is finished, and he has decided, with the same deliberateness he brings to the words he chooses in a speech or the arguments he advances in an editorial. exactly what he wants this image to say. The photographer makes the exposure. Another photograph of Frederick Douglass goes out into the world. According to the research of John Stauffer and his colleagues, who produced the book Picturing Frederick Douglass, published in 2015, Frederick Douglass sat for more photographs than any other American of the 19th century, more than Abraham Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, more than any president or general or public figure of the era. The current documented count stands at approximately 160 known photographs taken across roughly 50 years. From the early 1840s until shortly before his death in 1895, 160 photographs across 50 years is not an accident. It is not the natural byproduct of fame. It is a project, sustained and deliberate and theorized. And to understand why Frederick Douglass undertook it, you have to understand what the camera was being used for in America while he was using it for something else entirely. Photography arrived in the United States in the early 1840s, a technology so new that the social conventions for its use were still being established by the people who had access to it. For most Americans, the camera represented an opportunity for self-presentation, an affordable way to create a permanent record of your face and your dignity and your existence in the world. Families sat for portraits. Politicians commissioned images. Ordinary people saved money for the experience of seeing themselves fixed in silver on paper. For Black Americans, and specifically for enslaved Black Americans, the camera was being used for something different. Louis Agassiz was a Harvard scientist of considerable reputation who held a set of beliefs about racial hierarchy that were not fringe positions in 1850s American science, but were among the mainstream positions of a field that had organized much of its intellectual project around the justification of racial difference. Agassiz believed that the races of humanity were separately created, that they represented distinct and hierarchically ordered categories of human being, and that the evidence for this belief could be found in the physical characteristics of the body. In 1850, he commissioned a series of photographs of enslaved people in South Carolina, produced by a photographer named Joseph Zeely. The images were designed to document the physical characteristics that Agassiz wanted as scientific evidence. The people in the photographs are identified in the records only by their first names and their owners' names. They are presented as specimens, as objects of study, as evidence for a conclusion that had been decided before the camera was ever aimed at them. These images were part of a broader practice, documented by the scholar Brian Wallace and others, of using photography as an instrument of racial science, of producing images of black people designed to confirm, through the apparent objectivity of the photographic record, the hierarchical racial theories that people like Agassiz were advancing. The camera, in this use, was a tool of dehumanization. It stripped its subjects of individuality, of dignity, of the specific personhood that the system of slavery was simultaneously stripping from them in every other dimension of their lives. Frederick Douglass understood what was being done with the camera. He wrote about photography, which is a fact important enough to state plainly, because it means that what he was doing with the camera was not intuitive or unreflective, but theorized, grounded in a careful analysis of what photography was and what it could do and what it should be made to do by the people who understood its possibilities. He delivered lectures, including one titled Pictures and Progress. in which he argued that the capacity to make and consume images was a specifically human capacity, that the creation of idealized representations was one of the things that distinguished human beings from the rest of the natural world, and that the power to control your own image was therefore inseparable from the power to assert your own humanity. He was making this argument in the 1850s and 1860s, in lectures attended by the educated audiences of the Northern Lyceum Circuit. When Stauffer and his colleagues began the systematic documentation of Frederick's photographic record and the recovery of his lectures on photography, they were recovering a dimension of his intellectual project that most historical accounts, focused on the slavery and abolition story, had largely overlooked. The photographs themselves are the argument made visible. He does not smile. This is the first and most immediately visible choice, and it requires explanation because in the context of 19th century portraiture it was not the default. Frederick's expression, across photograph after photograph, spanning 5 decades, is something specific and consistent. It is direct. It is serious. It is the expression of a man looking at the camera with the full weight of his attention and his authority, who is not performing ease or comfort, or the kind of social softness that makes a powerful person seem approachable and therefore less threatening. He chose this expression deliberately, and he explained why in his lectures on photography. He argued that the image fixed in silver was more permanent than the spoken word or the written page, and that dignity, once fixed in an image, had a lasting power that the circumstances of a single encounter could not diminish. He wanted the photographs to do work that he could not always be present to do himself, to travel into rooms and into hands and into minds in his absence, and to assert, through the specific language of visual authority, that the man in the image was a man to be reckoned with. He wears suits. Across the photographs, across the decades, Frederick Douglass appears in the clothing of a professional man of the educated class. Well-cut coats, white shirts, the visual language of mid-19th century American respectability, worn not as a concession to someone else's standards, but as a claim, a deliberate and visible claim to the social standing that those standards indexed. His hair, in the photographs, is worn large and natural. The conventions of respectability that he was otherwise observing in his dress and his bearing did not extend to the erasure of the physical marker that most immediately identified him as a black man. He was not presenting himself as a man who happened to be black. He was presenting himself as a black man who was also, without contradiction or apology, a person of authority and dignity and intellectual standing. The combination was the argument. He sent photographs to newspapers and to supporters and to the growing network of people who knew his name but had not seen his face. He allowed his image to be reproduced as prints and engravings that circulated widely in the abolitionist community and beyond. The reproduction of his image was a form of argument that operated independently of his physical presence, that reached people who would never attend one of his lectures or read one of his books, that did the work of asserting his humanity in places he could never personally go. In the age of social media, we recognize immediately what Frederick was doing. The stakes of image control in a world where images circulate faster than context are legible to everyone now. Frederick had no vocabulary for what we would today call visual identity or narrative control. He had the analysis. He had the understanding of what was at stake, and he had the discipline to act on that understanding across 50 years, in studio after studio, sitting still while the photographer prepared, and then looking directly into the lens with the expression of a man who had something to say and was saying it without words. Look at the earliest photographs. From the 1840s, a young man in his mid to late 20s, recently escaped, newly famous, the intensity visible in the set of the jaw and the directness of the gaze. Look at the middle ones. From the 1850s and 1860s, a man at the height of his powers, the hair larger, the authority more settled, the expression carrying the weight of everything he has built and the full awareness of everything still to build. Look at the later ones. From the 1870s and 1880s, an older man, the hair white, the face carrying the specific topography of a life that has covered a great deal of ground, and still the gaze direct, still the expression carrying its authority, still the image doing exactly what he intended it to do. He was in his late 60s in those later photographs. He had been making this argument with the camera for 40 years. He had not gotten tired of making it, because the argument had not become less necessary. The images of black people circulating in the visual culture of the 1880s were not, for the most part, images like his. He knew this. He kept going to the studios. He kept sitting down. He kept looking directly into the lens with the expression of a man who has something to say and intends to keep saying it. 160 photographs, one argument, made over and over, with the patience of someone who understood that some arguments have to be made more than once before they are heard. The man in those photographs is looking directly at you, across 170 years, with the same expression he wore in every single one of them. He is still making the argument. Chapter 11. The Private Man Behind the Monument. Cedar Hill, Anacostia, Washington, D.C. An evening in the middle of the 1880s. The house sits on a hill above the city, a 21-room Victorian with a wide porch that looks out over the rooftops toward the public buildings and the slow bend of the Potomac in the distance. The last light of the day is moving off the dome of the Capitol. The city below is beginning to go quiet in the particular way that Washington goes quiet in the evenings. The official machinery of the Republic winding down for the night, while the actual consequences of what that machinery has produced continue in the lives of people the machinery does not see. The man on the porch is one of the most famous people in America. He has shaken hands with presidents in that building below. He has spoken in its chambers and its surrounding halls and its committee rooms, making arguments that moved some things and failed to move others, and that he will continue making tomorrow as he has made them every day for 40 years. He has been legally owned and legally purchased and legally appointed to positions that no person who looked like him had held before. He has written 3 autobiographies and delivered thousands of speeches and been photographed more times than any other American of his century. On this particular evening, he is sitting on his own porch and looking at his own city, the private man, and the life he lived inside the monument, is what this chapter is about. Start with the woman who made his freedom possible, and whom history has not treated justly. Anna Murray Douglass was born free in 1813 in Denton, Maryland. one of a large family, and came to Baltimore as a teenager to work as a domestic servant. She was 5 years older than Frederick. Practical where he was theoretical, grounded where he was visionary. She had not had the access to books and formal argument that Frederick had clawed out of his circumstances, but she was a person of formidable, practical intelligence, and what she saw in Frederick was, by the evidence of her subsequent actions, both a person she loved and a person whose project she understood and chose to support with everything she had. She sold a feather mattress to fund his escape. She sent him north with a borrowed sailor's uniform and borrowed papers and every dollar she had saved. She came north herself within days of his arrival, married him 12 days after he escaped, and then spent the next 44 years managing the household, raising 5 children, providing the domestic stability that Frederick's relentless public life required, harbouring freedom seekers on their way north through the network that ran through Rochester, taking in boarders to supplement the family's income when the newspaper was struggling financially, and doing all of this without receiving, from the public record or from most of the historical accounts that came after, more than a fraction of the recognition that the work deserved. She could not read. This fact has sometimes been used as if literacy were the measure of a person's significance. It is not. The historian Lee Fort, whose research on the women in Frederick's life produced the book Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, published in 2017, has documented carefully the degree to which Anna's presence in the historical record reflects choices made by Frederick and by the keepers of his legacy that left the most important woman in his life in the shadows of a story she had been central to from the beginning. Frederick acknowledged her in formal terms in his autobiographies and in public statements. He did not write about her with the depth and specificity that he brought to other subjects, and the reasons for this are not simple or reducible to a single cause. They include the conventions of a 19th century in which women's domestic labour was structurally invisible in public accounts of public men. They include Anna's own preference for privacy, and they include something else, something more complicated, that the historical record touches on without fully resolving. Her name was Ottilie Assing. Ottilie Assing was a German journalist who first met Frederick in 1856, when she visited Douglass at his home in Rochester to interview him for a German-language newspaper. She was 33 years old, intellectually sophisticated, deeply read in the European philosophical tradition, and she encountered Frederick as an intellectual equal in a way that produced, between two people who recognized each other's minds across a significant difference in background and circumstance, an immediate and powerful connection. She returned. She kept returning. For the next 28 years, she was a regular and extended presence in Frederick's life. She translated his second autobiography into German. She was a frequent guest in his homes. She wrote about him extensively for European audiences. She left him a significant sum in her will. The precise nature of their relationship is a question that historians have examined with care and have not resolved with certainty. The biographer Maria Diedrich, whose work on the relationship, titled Love Across Colour Lines, was published in 1999, argues on the basis of extensive documentary research that the relationship was a romantic one of considerable depth and duration. Other historians who have examined the same documentary record have been more cautious, noting that the evidence is consistent with Diedrich's interpretation, but does not make it certain, and that what the evidence definitively shows continues to be a matter of scholarly disagreement. What is not in dispute is that Ottilie Assing was a significant and sustained presence in Frederick's life for nearly 3 decades, and that Anna Douglass lived with whatever that arrangement meant to her in a silence that the historical record preserves but cannot interpret. Anna died in August of 1882. Frederick had been married to her for 44 years. The entirety of his freedom had been lived in the company of the woman who had helped make it possible. The grief he expressed at her death was genuine, preserved in letters and in the accounts of people who were with him in the period following her death. He described her as the person who had held together everything that allowed everything else to exist. 18 months after Anna's death, in January of 1884, Frederick married Helen Pitts. Helen Pitts was a white woman from a prominent New York family, educated at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, a suffragist and reformer who had been working as a clerk in Frederick's office when he was Recorder of Deeds in Washington, D.C. She was around 20 years younger than Frederick. They had known each other for several years before Anna's death. The response was immediate and came from multiple directions simultaneously. White critics argued that the marriage violated the social order they were prepared to enforce through ostracism and condemnation. Helen's father refused to speak to Frederick for years. Parts of the black community argued that Frederick had, by choosing a white wife, sent a troubling message about the value he placed on black womanhood, that the man who had spent his career arguing for the humanity and dignity of black people had made a personal choice that sat in complicated tension with those arguments. Frederick addressed the criticism directly and without apology. He said that his first wife had been the colour of his mother and his second wife the colour of his father, a formulation that acknowledged his own mixed heritage and that was received by some as a genuine expression of his belief that race was a construct that should not govern the most intimate decisions of a human life, and by others as a deflection from a question that deserved a more direct answer. Helen was a person of evident substance who held her own in the intellectual and public life that Frederick's world required. She helped manage his correspondence and his papers in the later years of his life, with a competence and commitment that the record documents clearly, by the accounts of people who knew them. The marriage was a genuinely companionate one, characterized by shared interests and mutual respect, and the specific warmth of two people who had chosen each other with full awareness of the complications of the choice. His children had complicated responses to both the marriage and to the larger dynamics of their relationship with their father. Lewis and Charles Douglass had served in the Civil War with distinction and had spent their adult lives working in Frederick's orbit. And the relationship between a father of Frederick's stature and children whose own significant accomplishments were perpetually measured against that stature carried its own particular pressures. Lee Fort's research documents the family dynamics of these years with particular care, noting the specific tensions that accumulated around a household organized, for decades, around the needs and reputation of one extraordinarily demanding public life. Frederick had been a distant father in the most literal sense for much of his children's childhood, because the demands of his public life had kept him travelling for significant portions of every year. He loved his children. He was not always present in the ways that love required, and the gap between the love and the presence was a gap that some of his children were never entirely able to close. The house on the hill in Anacostia was the most stable domestic base he had ever had. He had bought Cedar Hill in 1877, and it had become, over the years, the place where the travelling and the arguing and the decades of sustained public effort came home to rest. He received visitors there. He entertained. He continued to write and speak with a regularity that men, a generation younger, would have found demanding. He was not a monument. He was a man who had loved and lost and chosen again, a man who had complicated relationships with his children and a complicated history with the women he had loved and a complicated relationship with the institutions he had served and criticized simultaneously, a man who had made choices that his critics found troubling and choices that his admirers found inspiring and choices that were simply human, made under the specific pressures of a specific life that no general principle could have fully guided. The monument was the public version. The porch in the evening was the private version. Both were true. Both were Frederick Douglass. The city spread out below him, the last light moving off the Capitol dome, the river going dark in the distance, the evening air carrying the sounds of a capital that was still, in his estimation, not yet the republic it had claimed it would be, since the documents were signed and the promises were made and the argument was begun. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Chapter 12. The Last Speech and the Last Day. The morning of February 20th, 1895, begins for Frederick Douglass the way most mornings in the last years of his life begin, with correspondence, with the ongoing business of a man whose public presence generates a volume of letters and invitations and requests that has not diminished with age, because the argument has not diminished with age, and the argument still requires the man. He is 77 years old by most reckonings, though the uncertainty about his birth year means that the number carries the same approximation it always has. He is going this morning to a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C. His connection to the women's movement goes back further than most people in that room are aware. In July of 1848, at the first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York, he had been one of the few men present and one of the vocal supporters of the resolution calling for women's right to vote, at a time when that position was considered so extreme that many of the convention's own organizers were reluctant to include it in the final document. His support had been genuine and principled, grounded in the same analysis that had organized his entire public life, that the argument for human dignity and equal rights could not be made selectively, could not be applied to some people and withheld from others without undermining itself at the root. He arrives at the meeting and is given a seat of honor on the platform. The accounts of people who were there describe a man who is still, at 77, a commanding presence. The white hair, the large frame, the bearing that decades of public life have shaped into something that rooms respond to before he opens his mouth. He speaks. The accounts describe a well-received address that engaged the audience on the questions of rights and dignity and the obligations of a republic that has not yet fully delivered on its founding promises. The language is the language he has been using for 50 years, refined and deepened by 50 years of use, still carrying the specific force that language carries when the person using it has earned every word of it through direct experience. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, his ally in the suffrage movement for nearly 5 decades, is among those present at the meeting that morning. Their connection goes back to Seneca Falls in 1848, to the specific moment when Frederick had risen to support a resolution that Stanton herself had written but was not certain could pass, and his support had helped carry it. Nearly half a century of shared work and occasional disagreement, and the specific durability of a partnership built on principle rather than convenience, had brought them both to this room on this morning. He comes home to Cedar Hill in the afternoon. Helen is there. He is describing the events of the morning to her, animated in the way that public people are animated when they have just come from a room that responded to them. The house is the house he has lived in for nearly 20 years, the most permanent domestic space he has ever occupied, and the familiar weight of it is around him in the afternoon light. But before we reach the ending that this day holds, there is something from the years just before it that belongs in this chapter, something that the public record of his final years tends to pass over too quickly. In the fall of 1892, a young journalist and activist named Ida B. Wells published a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors, documenting, with meticulous and courageous precision, the epidemic of lynching that was consuming black life across the South. Wells had been born in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, the daughter of enslaved parents who were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. She had become, by the early 1890s, the most rigorous journalist in America on the subject of racial violence, documenting the numbers of killings, naming the victims, refuting the justifications offered by the perpetrators and the press that covered for them, and doing all of this under threat of death. Her Memphis newspaper office having been destroyed by a mob the previous spring. Southern Horrors needed an introduction. Wells asked Frederick Douglass to write it. He wrote it without hesitation. What he produced was not a perfunctory endorsement from a famous name. It was a genuine engagement with her argument, written with the full force of his own accumulated authority and with the specific generosity of a man who understood that what she was doing was the continuation of the work he had spent his life doing, applied to the specific and urgent crisis of the moment she was living inside. He wrote that there had been no word equal to her pamphlet in convincing power, that her work had baptized with living fire the heart of the American people. He placed the full weight of his name and his reputation behind her documentation and her argument, at a time when that support cost something real, because endorsing Wells meant endorsing an analysis that made powerful white allies, including some in the women's suffrage movement, deeply uncomfortable. He gave that support anyway, because it was what the moment required, because the accounting was still running, as it had always run, patient and exact, and the accounting told him clearly that this was the right side to be on, and that the cost of being on it was not a cost that a man who had lived his life the way he had lived his life had any standing to refuse. He was 74 years old when he wrote that introduction. He had been fighting this argument, in one form or another, since the morning his grandmother walked back into the woods. The young woman who had asked him for his support was 30 years younger than him and was doing work that he recognized, in its courage and its precision and its refusal to let the comfortable version of the story stand in place of the true version, as the work that needed doing next. The torch was being passed, not in a ceremony, but in the way that such things actually happen, quietly, in the act of one person standing behind another and saying, clearly and publicly, that what that person is doing matters and is right. The afternoon at Cedar Hill is still ahead of us. Frederick falls to his knees. The cause was most likely cardiac arrest. Though the historical record does not provide a precise medical account, he was dead within minutes. Helen was with him. The man who had been speaking in public that morning about the rights of women to participate fully in the civic life of the Republic was gone before the evening came. He died on the same day he had spoken in public about freedom. There is no way to write that sentence and make it sound like anything other than what it is. The news moved through Washington and then through the country with the speed that telegraph technology permitted, and the response it produced gives you a measure of what his presence in American life had meant. Black communities across the South and the North received it with a grief that was not only the grief of losing a famous person, but the grief of losing someone who had, for the entire living memory of people who were themselves middle-aged, been the most visible and most consistent public voice for their humanity and their rights. People who had been born into slavery and had lived to see its legal end had done so with Frederick Douglass's voice as part of the audible landscape of their freedom. His body lay in state at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington. Thousands of people passed through, standing in lines that extended around the block and did not shorten through the hours of the public viewing. Men and women who had travelled from other cities, people who had never met him and who nevertheless stood in line because standing in line was the only available form of saying what his life had meant to theirs. The funeral was attended by senators and by domestic workers, by the people for whom his arguments had been made at the level of political strategy, and by the people for whom those same arguments had been made at the level of daily survival. Susan B. Anthony was there. Ida B. Wells was there, the woman whose work he had supported at the cost of comfort, standing now at the funeral of the man who had stood behind her when standing behind her mattered most. His body was taken by train to Rochester, New York, where Anna Murray Douglass was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. He was buried beside her. The man who had been separated from his mother before he was old enough to grieve the separation, the man who had been taken from his grandmother on a path through the woods when he was 6 years old, the man who had built and lost and rebuilt the closest relationships of his life across 7 decades of extraordinary and costly living, was laid to rest beside the woman who had sold a feather mattress and sent him north into a future that neither of them could see clearly from where they were standing. The ground of Mount Hope Cemetery holds both of them. In the city where the North Star was first printed, under the same sky that pressed down on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1818, when a boy who did not know his own birthday opened his eyes on a world that had not yet been asked to account for what it would make of him. It has been asking ever since. Chapter 13. What Frederick Douglass Demands of Us. Rochester, New York, July 5th, 1852. The windows of Corinthian Hall are open in the July heat, and the sounds of the 4th of July celebrations are drifting in from the streets outside. Music. Voices. The sounds of a holiday that means, for the people in those streets, what holidays are supposed to mean. Frederick Douglass is 34 years old. He has been asked by the Rochester Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society to give an address appropriate to the occasion. He is 14 years out of slavery, running his own newspaper, at the height of his rhetorical powers, and he has decided, looking at the invitation and at the open windows and at the sounds coming through them, to tell the truth instead. He has been building toward this speech his entire life. He begins by honouring the founders. He says they were brave men who placed principle above comfort, who made an argument for the natural rights of human beings that was genuine and compelling, and that he has no interest in diminishing. He praises them with the specificity of a man who has read their words carefully and found in them what they actually contain. And then he turns. He says that the distance between him and the audience he is addressing is not a distance of shared celebration, but a distance of separated experience. That the 4th of July is not his 4th of July. That the independence it celebrates is not his independence. That the freedom it commemorates is a freedom he and the millions of enslaved people in the southern states are excluded from. And that the exclusion is not incidental to the Republic, but central to its actual operating structure, embedded in its laws and protected by its institutions, and celebrated every 4th of July by people who do not pause to ask what the celebration means to the people it is conducted over. He says the existence of slavery in a republic organized around the principles of natural rights is not a political complication to be managed around. It is a contradiction to be resolved. He says it in front of an audience that invited him to say something else. He follows the argument where it leads. He does not stop at the place where the argument becomes comfortable. The speech is widely regarded by historians as one of the most powerful addresses in American public life. It is still being read aloud every 4th of July, in cities across the United States, by people who understand that the question it asks has not been fully answered. What to the slave is the 4th of July? The question is 170 years old. It still carries the quality of something spoken directly to the present moment, because the distance it describes between the promise of the Republic and the reality experienced by people the Republic has not yet fully included in its promises, is a distance that has changed in its specific form across those 170 years, but has not closed to zero. Frederick Douglass demands something of us. It is worth being precise about what that something is. He demands honesty, not the honesty of confession, the performance of acknowledging that bad things happened in order to move past them quickly and comfortably, the honesty of sustained engagement with the full complexity of the historical record, the honesty of looking at what the Republic has done and what it has failed to do without allowing the achievements to cancel the failures, or the failures to cancel the achievements, because both are real and both matter, and the honest account requires holding both simultaneously without collapsing into either. He was himself the example of this demand. He praised Lincoln and he criticized Lincoln. He celebrated the 13th Amendment, and he warned that legal abolition was not the same as actual freedom. He accepted federal appointments, and he noted the contradictions embedded in accepting them. He honored the founders, and he called out their hypocrisy. He held the full complexity of everything he observed without collapsing it into a simple story, because he understood that simple stories, however comforting, are a form of dishonesty, and that dishonesty was the one thing his entire life had been organized against. He demands persistence. He spent 50 years arguing for the same set of principles in an enormous variety of contexts, adjusting his methods and his tactics as the situation required, while maintaining the underlying argument with a consistency that no political defeat could interrupt for long. He was defeated often. Reconstruction was a defeat. The Supreme Court decision of 1883 was a defeat. The consolidation of the Jim Crow system across the South was a defeat. He absorbed each one, analyzed it, and continued. Not because he was immune to discouragement. His own accounts of his interior life in these periods make clear that he felt the losses fully, but because he understood something that the moments of defeat made it easy to forget. He understood that the arc of the argument was longer than any single defeat, that the principles he was arguing for were sound, that sound principles, persistently argued, with the full weight of evidence and experience behind them, had a cumulative power that no single political setback could ultimately negate. He demands that we take the full measure of what was lost. The destruction that the slave system accomplished was not only the physical destruction of bodies, though the physical destruction was real and enormous and documented, it was the destruction of families, of languages, of cultural continuities, of the specific knowledge and histories that communities carry forward across generations, and that, once broken, do not simply reconstitute themselves when the legal condition changes. The formerly enslaved people of the South in 1865 were not simply people who had been in bondage and were now free. They were people who had been systematically deprived, across generations, of the accumulated resources that freedom requires to be meaningful. And the question of what the Republic owed them for that deprivation was a question that Reconstruction raised and did not answer, and that the collapse of Reconstruction deferred for generations. Many historians and economists have connected the specific policy failures of the Reconstruction era to patterns that persisted through the 20th century and into the present, tracing lines of consequence from the decisions made and not made in the 1860s and 1870s to disparities that are still visible in the historical and economic record today. Frederick raised that question explicitly and repeatedly. He was not sufficiently heard. The foundation was not built. The consequences of that failure are part of the history we have inherited, whether or not we chose to inherit it. He demands, finally, that we refuse the comfortable version of his story. The comfortable version makes him a hero whose arc resolves cleanly, from slavery to freedom to fame, from the dirt floor in Maryland to the house on the hill in Anacostia, from property to the most photographed man in 19th century America. The comfortable version ends at the triumph, and the triumph resolves the tension. The argument is won. The man is honoured. The monument is built. Frederick Douglass refused the comfortable version while he was alive. He refused it in the speeches he gave in the last years of his life, in the letters he wrote in the 1880s and 1890s documenting the dismantling of everything Reconstruction had built, in the support he gave to Ida B. Wells at a time when supporting her cost something real. He would refuse it now, not because the achievements were not real. They were real, and earned at a cost that most people will never be required to pay, but because the achievements were never the end of the argument. They were stages in an argument that he understood was longer than any single life, and that required, from the people who inherited it, the same quality that had allowed him to keep making it from a dirt floor in Maryland to a house on a hill in Washington, D.C. The quality of refusing to stop. Come back to Corinthian Hall for a moment. The windows are open. The sounds of the celebration are drifting in from outside. The audience is waiting. The man at the front of the room is 34 years old and has been building toward this moment since the morning his grandmother walked back into the woods. He opens his mouth. Outside, the holiday continues. The music and the voices and the sounds of people celebrating a freedom that is real for some of them and not yet real for all of them. On a July afternoon in 1852, in a city that does not yet know what it will cost to close that distance. Inside, the room goes still. He is still speaking. The question is still open. The July air moves through the windows. and Frederick Douglass, who was born without a birthday and owned before he could walk, and who refused, every single day of his life, to be what the world had decided he was, stands in the summer light and asks the question that still has no clean answer, and waits, and the silence that follows is the silence in which the answer, if there is to be one, has to be built by us, tonight, and every morning after, wherever you are right now, in whatever hour this finds you. Thank you for staying until the end. Until the next story, I wish you a quiet night